Would you believe me if I told you that I once had to choose between my daughter's life and my faith? My name is Grace Whitaker. I'm 58 years old, and I live in a quiet town on the outskirts of Waco, Texas. I've been a seamstress for most of my life, the kind of woman people pass by without really noticing. Just another face in a small-town grocery store. But behind that quiet life is a story I never thought I'd be able to speak aloud. I kept it buried for years. Out of fear, out of shame, out of loyalty to people who claimed to speak for God. But when your child is lying in a hospital bed, barely breathing, and they hand you a form and say, "Sign here if you want to save her life," what you believe gets stripped down to one question. Would God really ask me to let her die, just to prove I was faithful? I wasn't always part of that kind of belief system. When I was 17, I was lost. My mama had just passed from cancer, and my daddy, well, he didn't take it well. He turned to drinking, disappeared for days, and when he did come home, he wasn't the same. I was grieving, angry, and completely alone. That's when a neighbor, sweet Miss Jolene, invited me to a Kingdom Hall meeting. She said I'd find a family there, and I did. Smiles, kind words, clean-cut people with warm handshakes and promises of hope. They told me Jehovah would heal my pain, give me purpose, and bring me into a spiritual family that would never abandon me. I was 17, scared, and desperate to belong. So I clung to it, and before long, I was baptized. But what I didn't understand then, what no one tells you when you're young and broken, is that in that world, love comes with conditions. You're only accepted if you obey, only valued if you never question. And once you start asking, once you start wondering, even silently, the walls close in. At 21, I married a man from the congregation, David. He was considered exemplary. We married quickly because that's what they encouraged. Better to marry than to burn. That's what they always said. 2 years after our daughter was born, David left. No warning, no goodbye. Just a note on the kitchen table. "I can't do this. I'm not worthy to be the head of this family." From that day on, it was just me and Lily. And if you've ever been a single mother inside a community like that, you know what it means to carry guilt that isn't yours. You try harder. You give more. You stay silent. Because they tell you that faithful mothers raise faithful children, and that your sacrifice will be rewarded in the new world. So I stitched clothes for other people's children while Lily wore hand-me-downs. I skipped meals to make sure I had enough for the monthly donation envelope. I kept my head down, my questions to myself, and my heart wrapped in scripture I didn't dare interpret alone. And for years, that's how I lived. Not fully alive, not fully dead, just obedient. Until one morning, Lily collapsed in our kitchen. Her small body hit the linoleum floor like a broken doll, and everything I thought I believed cracked open in one terrifying second. I still remember the sound her body made when she fell. It wasn't loud. It was soft, too soft, like something sacred breaking in silence. Lily was 11, thin, sweet, with a head full of curls and a laugh that could light up the darkest Sunday. That morning, she had barely touched her toast. I thought she was just tired from the weekend meeting. I didn't expect her to fall like that. One moment standing, the next lying still, her eyes rolled back, lips pale, arms limp. I screamed her name, but she didn't answer. My hands shook so bad I could barely lift her. She felt weightless, like the life had already slipped from her bones. I carried her out the front door and into the street barefoot, screaming for help. A neighbor, Mr. Dillard, was pulling weeds in his yard. He dropped everything, ran to us, and drove us to the hospital faster than I could pray. I didn't even realize I was crying until I saw the drops hitting Lily's dress in the emergency room. She was taken away from me. Machines, cords, doctors and nurses moving in rhythms I couldn't understand. One of them, a woman maybe in her early 30s, sat me down in a cold metal chair and looked me in the eyes. She said words that didn't make sense at first. Blood disorder, bone marrow tests, transfusions. Transfusions. That one word pulled me out of the fog and straight into panic, because inside the congregation, that word was death. Not the death of the body, but of the soul. I had been taught over and over that accepting a blood transfusion was equivalent to rejecting Jehovah, that it was better to die faithful than to live defiled. I'd read the Watchtower stories. Children praised for refusing blood, martyrs in tiny suits and dresses, parents holding their hands as they slipped away, not with sorrow, but with pride. I looked at the doctor and nodded, but I didn't say anything. She handed me consent forms. I told her I needed to think. She said there was no time. When I got home that night, I collapsed on the living room floor. Not the couch, not the bed, just the floor, cold, hard, and real, and I cried. Not the kind of crying I used to do during prayer, those measured sobs asking Jehovah for strength. Number. This was different. This was the cry of a mother who no longer knew who she was praying to, or if she was praying at all. There was no Bible in my hand that night, no Watchtower, no carefully highlighted verse. There was only silence. And the overwhelming question, if God is love, why would he ask me to let her die? I laid there for hours. I don't even remember falling asleep. But I remember waking up and thinking of something I hadn't thought of in years. A pamphlet, a small Christian tract someone had handed me at a gas station long ago. I had hidden it inside an old sewing box. I was afraid to throw it away, but too afraid to read it. The elders had warned us. Anything from the outside world was spiritual poison. But that night, I was already poisoned by doubt. So I opened it. It was simple, no pictures. Just a cross and a handwritten phrase across the top. Jesus saves. Not Jehovah's organization saves. Not obedience saves. Just Jesus. I pressed it to my chest and sobbed like a child. Because for the first time in my life, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, God wasn't who I'd been told he was. I spent that whole night sitting by her hospital bed. Machines beeped steadily in the background, casting a strange rhythm over the room. The lights were too bright, too sterile. Everything smelled like bleach and fear. Lily's skin looked like porcelain, too pale, too still. Her eyelids fluttered now and then, but she didn't wake. I held that little pamphlet in my hand, folding and unfolding the corner like a nervous habit. Jesus saves. 3 words I couldn't stop repeating in my mind. Not because I understood them fully, but because they felt like a life raft in the middle of a sea I didn't know I was drowning in. That morning, the doctor returned with results. Leukemia. Aggressive. Immediate transfusions required. No other way forward. She placed the consent form in front of me again. Same paper, same weight. But something in me had shifted. I stepped outside the hospital, walked the streets like a ghost. My legs moved, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. I passed by the Kingdom Hall on the corner. It was quiet, empty, but just seeing it sent a chill through my body, because I knew what they'd say if they found out. I knew the words, the scriptures, the shame, and the consequence. disfellowshipment, being marked, being shunned by everyone I'd known and trusted for over 30 years. But then I thought, were they there with me last night when I held my daughter's hand through the wires? Were they beside me when I whispered, "Please don't leave me," into the dark? Number. They weren't. They never were. Just then my phone buzzed. A message from Sister Karen. Remember, obedience is more important than understanding. Trust Jehovah. I stared at that message for a long time. Then I turned the screen off because I was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, obedience without love wasn't faith. It was fear. And I was done being afraid. That night I went back to the hospital. I kissed Lily's forehead and I whispered, "I'm not going to let you die just to prove something to people who never really saw us." And for the first time in decades, I felt like I could breathe. If this story is reaching something in you, if it echoes in the places you thought were long buried, please don't scroll away. Please don't stay silent like I did for so many years. Share it. Comment. Let someone else know they're not alone. Because somewhere there's another mother in a waiting room, and she needs to hear that choosing love is not betrayal. The next morning I returned to the hospital early. The hallway was quiet, echoing with the distant hum of machines and nurses' soft footsteps. A nurse I hadn't seen before met me at the nurses' station. Her name tag read, Carmen. She had warm eyes, the kind that see through you but don't judge. She gently took my hand and said, "You don't have to say anything, ma'am. I just want you to know, Jesus didn't come to condemn you. He came to bring life. Life in abundance." I hadn't told her a single thing. I hadn't explained the religion, the doctrine, the choice. But somehow, she knew. I nodded, unable to speak, and walked down the hall to Lily's room. She was awake, barely, her lips dry, eyes glassy. She looked at me, and in the smallest voice I've ever heard, asked, "Mom, is Jehovah going to heal me?" And in that moment, something broke in me, not in anger, not in bitterness, but in clarity. Jehovah, the version I was raised to believe in, wasn't there. Not in that room, not in her question, not in her eyes. God was in the love, in the way her hand reached for mine, in the silent plea behind her tired gaze. I didn't answer her right away. I just held her hand and whispered, "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Later that day, I walked into the waiting room to find Sister Paula sitting with her Bible in her lap. She didn't ask how Lily was. She didn't even look up. She simply said, "Jehovah is testing you, Grace. He wants to know where your loyalty truly lies." I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I just smiled politely and said, "My daughter is lying between life and death. If your God wants to use her suffering to test me, then maybe he's not the God I thought he was." She looked stunned, but I didn't wait for a reply. I turned and walked away. That night, I sat by Lily's bed again. Her breathing was shallow, her body weak, and I realized I wasn't just fighting for her life. I was fighting for mine too, because faith that demands you abandon love isn't faith. It's fear disguised as holiness. I picked up the consent form again, ran my fingers over the page, took a deep breath, and I signed it. My hand shook, tears ran down my face, but I signed it. And in that moment, I didn't feel rebellious. I didn't feel like an apostate. I felt like a mother. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt free. Lily received her first transfusion that evening. The nurses moved quickly, gently, like they knew this moment wasn't just medical. It was sacred. I sat in the corner of the room, hands clasped tightly, watching the color return to her cheeks. slowly, softly, like dawn creeping over a cold horizon. She didn't open her eyes right away, but when she did, she smiled. It was faint, fragile, but it was real. I'll never forget that smile. It was the smile of a child pulling back from the edge and knowing her mother pulled with her. I wanted to believe it was over, that the hardest part had passed, but the storm was just beginning. The very next day, I received a message from one of the elders, Brother Ray. "We need to talk. Your spiritual standing is at risk." I didn't reply. A few hours later, Sister Karen came by the house. She didn't bring flowers. She didn't ask about Lily. She brought a folded magazine and a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Grace," she said, standing in my doorway like a shadow. "Did you sign the form?" I didn't lie. I didn't explain. "Yes," I said, "because I couldn't watch my daughter die for a rule made by men." She paused, lowered her eyes, then whispered, almost like a verdict, "Then you've turned away from Jehovah." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I just answered, "No." I finally turned toward him. She left the magazine on my table, opened to a page titled, "The Unforgivable Sin, Accepting Blood," and walked away without saying goodbye. That night, the house felt different, not because of the weather, but because I had been declared unclean, outcast, invisible. They didn't need to say the word. But it came anyway, in a brown envelope 2 days later. No return address, no signature, disfellowshipped. Just like that, no conversation, no prayer, no mercy. I had been erased, not from a church, but from a world I had once called home. I stood in the kitchen, holding that letter with trembling hands, and for a moment, I felt like I was floating outside my own life, like I could see the version of Grace they wanted me to be, disappearing in smoke. But even in that pain, something in me whispered, "You did the right thing. You saved your daughter. You chose love." After the letter, the silence was immediate. It didn't take days or weeks. It was instant, like a light switch flipped off in the middle of my world. People I'd known for decades, women I'd hugged during baptisms, men who'd prayed over my child when she had a fever, vanished. No calls, no texts, no visits. At the market, Sister Lillian crossed the street to avoid me. Her husband pretended not to hear when I said hello. Even the cashier at the corner store, who used to ask about Lily's school, kept his eyes on the register and didn't speak a word. It was as if I had died. And maybe I had. Not physically. But to them, I was gone. A spiritual casualty. A warning story in the making. The hardest part wasn't their silence. It was knowing I used to believe in it. I used to be one of them. I used to nod when others were disfellowshipped. I used to think, they must have done something wrong. And now, I was on the other side of that judgment. But Lily was alive. That was my anchor. She slept more peacefully now. Her cheeks had color again. Her voice, though faint, carried laughter. One evening, as I tucked her into bed, she whispered, "Mom, are we bad now?" I felt the air leave my lungs. "No, sweetheart," I said, stroking her hair gently. "We're not bad. We're brave." She blinked up at me, trying to understand, then nodded as if that made sense in her little heart. After she fell asleep, I sat in the kitchen staring at my old Bible. Not the magazines, not the booklets, just the Bible. I opened it with trembling hands, unsure of what I would find. And there it was, a verse I hadn't read in years, maybe never really saw before. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." I didn't cry, not at first. I just sat there, hand over my heart, feeling something crack open in the quiet. A God who offers rest. Not conditions, not surveillance, just rest. I didn't know what to call it yet. Didn't know what it meant for my future, but in that moment, I stopped trying to be perfect and started trying, to be honest. A week later, someone knocked on my door. It was Aunt Margaret. We hadn't spoken in over 10 years. She'd left the religion a long time ago, back when I was still young and convinced she was lost. I remembered how the elders warned us about her. She thinks she's free, but she's blind, they said. I believed them. I kept my distance. I didn't return her calls. I didn't invite her to my wedding. I even avoided her at Mama's funeral. And yet, there she was, on my porch, with a basket of cornbread and a quiet smile. I heard, she said gently, about Lily, about you. I didn't know what to say. I just stood there, trembling. She reached out and pulled me into a hug. It wasn't tight. It wasn't rushed. It was the kind of hug that tells you don't have to explain a thing. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I had once folded tracts and donation envelopes. Now it held coffee mugs and 2 women who had nothing left to pretend. I told her everything. Not just the decision, but the guilt, the silence, the cold stares, the fear that maybe I was wrong. She listened, never interrupted. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out her Bible. Old, worn, full of notes in the margins. She opened it to Romans, read softly, "You did not receive a spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you received the spirit of adoption, by whom we cry out, Abba, Father." I hadn't heard a scripture spoken that way in years. Not like a weapon, not like a checklist, but like a whisper from someone who'd been there. I looked at her through blurry eyes. "Do you think God forgives me?" Aunt Margaret took my hand across the table. "Grace, He never left you. You were the one being brave enough to love like He does. Don't confuse punishment from people with the heart of God." I couldn't hold it in anymore. I cried like a little girl. Not because I was broken, but because for the first time someone saw me. Not as a failure, but as a mother who chose love over fear. That night, I didn't pray out of habit. I didn't recite a script. I just whispered, "God, I don't know what comes next, but if you're still with me, please stay." The house was quiet that night. Not the kind of quiet that crushes you, but the kind that lets you breathe for the first time in years. Lily was sleeping peacefully down the hall. I could hear the soft hum of her monitor and her gentle breathing behind the cracked door. Her recovery would take time, but her color had returned. Her strength was slowly building. Her laughter, though faint, had returned. And with every smile, a little more of my fear loosened its grip. I sat on the edge of my bed holding that Bible Aunt Margaret had left me. Its cover was worn, its pages thin and folded, like something that had lived a full life. I didn't open it to any particular book. I just ran my fingers over the pages, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Permission. Permission to ask, to wonder, to hope. I closed my eyes, and I whispered the first prayer that felt like mine. Not a formula, not a recital, just breath and ache and honesty. I don't know what I'm doing, but I don't want to be afraid of you anymore. There was no vision, no voice from the clouds, but something shifted, a warmth in my chest, a stillness in my mind, not certainty, not even answers, just presence. Like God had been waiting patiently in the background, not to judge, but to walk with me when I was ready to walk, honestly. The next day, Lily woke up early. Her hair was messy. Her voice was raspy. But her eyes were bright. She held up a drawing she'd made with the crayons the hospital chaplain had brought. It was a picture of us, me and her, holding hands, with a sun above us and a figure behind, arms open wide. "Who's this?" I asked, pointing to the figure. She looked up at me and said, "That's Jesus. He's watching us." I didn't correct her. I didn't explain. I just pulled her into my arms and held her close. Because in her little heart, she already knew something I was only just beginning to understand. That God didn't live in a building. He wasn't trapped in a rule book. And he wasn't asking us to earn his love. He was right here, in the recovery, in the stillness, in the smile of a child who knew she'd been carried through something sacred. It was Aunt Margaret who invited me, not to a service, not to a revival, to a gathering. "Nothing formal," she said. "Just some folks who love Jesus and aren't afraid to say they're still healing." I hesitated. Part of me still flinched at the idea of sitting in any kind of circle with the word faith in the air. I wasn't ready to be preached to again. I wasn't ready to be told where I'd gone wrong. But Margaret just smiled, handed me a jar of peach preserves, and said, "No one's coming to fix you, Grace. Just come as you are." That Sunday, we walked into a garage. Not a church, no stained glass, no pulpit, no sound system. Just a folding table with a Bible on it, mismatched chairs, a thermos of weak coffee, and a circle of people who looked like they'd been cracked open by life. Just like me. There were no rehearsed lines, no three-point sermons, just stories. A woman named Linda talked about losing her son to addiction. A man named George spoke through tears about growing up under a preacher father who preached one thing and lived another. No one interrupted, no one judged. They just listened. When it came my turn, I said I wasn't ready to speak, and no one pressured me. But afterward, Linda placed her hand over mine and said, "You don't have to explain your pain. It's already speaking." Something in me softened, not all at once, but enough. We stayed for 2 hours. Then we drove home, windows down, Lily in the back seat singing softly to herself. The wind carried something that felt like release. That night, I stood at the sink washing dishes. The house was dim, quiet. I thought about how many hours I had spent serving a God I didn't understand. Giving and giving. Never feeling like I'd done enough. But now, standing barefoot in my own kitchen, hands in warm soapy water, sunset pouring in through the window, I finally felt something I hadn't in decades. Enough. Not because I was righteous, not because I had all the answers, but because I had stopped pretending. And God, he met me there, not in the noise, but in the quiet. It started with a notebook, a small spiral-bound pad I kept in the drawer next to the stove, the kind you use for grocery lists and old recipes. One evening, while Lily was coloring at the table, I pulled it out, and I wrote a sentence. Just one. I watched my daughter nearly die while I obeyed voices that never loved her. I stared at it for a long time, not because it was profound, but because it was mine. It wasn't filtered, it wasn't approved, it wasn't revised to fit someone else's version of righteousness. It was raw, unpolished, sacred. That night, I wrote 3 more sentences, then 5, then pages. Every word came from a part of me that had been gagged for years. Each memory I wrote down loosened another knot in my chest. I didn't know if I would ever show it to anyone. I wasn't writing to convince. I wasn't writing to accuse. I was writing to survive. A few days later, Aunt Margaret came by again with a warm pie and her same gentle eyes. I handed her the notebook without saying anything. She read in silence. Halfway through, she placed her hand over her mouth. By the end, she was crying. "Grace," she whispered. This is light. This isn't just your story. It's a lifeline for someone else." I shook my head. "I'm not a preacher. I'm not a teacher. I'm just broken." She smiled through her tears. "Number, you're free. And people need to know what freedom sounds like." The next week, she brought an old recording device. Said we could record my voice. Just my voice. No faces. No names. At first, I resisted. Then Lily walked in with another one of her drawings. 2 women holding hands under a tree. A little girl with a pink dress in between. And above them, a line she'd written herself. "Jesus loves us even when we're quiet." I don't know what happened inside me in that moment, but I sat down, pressed record, and I began to speak. My voice trembled. I stumbled over words. But I told the truth. And when I finished, I didn't feel shame. I felt released. We uploaded the recording anonymously. No name, no photo. Just my voice, whispering into a void I wasn't sure would ever answer back. The first few days, nothing happened. A handful of listens. One comment that said thank you. I thought that would be it. And I was okay with that. Because for me, just speaking it out loud felt like a resurrection. But then, on the 4th day, the messages began. First, a woman from Alabama, then another from Idaho, then 3 from South Texas. Different stories, different pain. But all of them said the same thing. "I thought I was the only one." One woman wrote, "My son died waiting for a transplant. I told him God would reward his sacrifice. Now I can't sleep. Your words brought me back to the truth I buried." Another messaged me late one night. "I left the congregation 3 years ago and haven't spoken a word since. But after hearing your voice, I cried for the first time in years. Thank you for saying what I couldn't." I read each one slowly, hands shaking, and with every sentence, something in me steadied. Not because I had the answers, not because I wanted to be a leader, but because I realized truth makes space for others to breathe. Of course, not all messages were kind. Some came sharp, wrapped in scripture and shame. "Apostate. You're leading others to destruction. Jehovah will judge you." I expected them. I didn't even flinch, because this time I knew the difference between correction and control, between accountability and abuse. This time I didn't read those messages with guilt. I read them with grief. Grief for the version of me who once believed them, who once sent them, who once feared them. But that version of Grace had died on a hospital floor. The night I chose my daughter over their doctrine, and in her place stood a woman who finally understood what redemption really sounded like. A few weeks after the recording began circulating, something shifted inside me. Not a dramatic moment, not a grand revelation, but something quiet, like a door unlocking from the inside. Women started showing up, not all at once, and not dramatically. Some emailed me first. Others just showed up at the edge of my porch, standing with bags under their eyes and pain in their posture. Most of them didn't come to talk. They came to sit, to listen, to exhale. I started keeping extra chairs in the living room, some mismatched from yard sales, others borrowed from neighbors. There was never an invitation, only the understanding that if you needed a place to not be judged, my door stayed open. One Saturday afternoon, I rearranged the living room to fit 6 chairs. By nightfall, we had filled 9. There was Patricia, a woman in her 70s whose husband had been an elder for 30 years. There was Elena, a mother of 3 who had once written watchtower study questions in perfect calligraphy but hadn't prayed out loud in a decade. There was Maya, young, newly married, afraid to speak even her own thoughts without trembling. We didn't preach. We didn't sing. We shared. We cried. We sat in silence. We passed tissues like communion. Sometimes we read a psalm. Sometimes we just lit a candle and let the room breathe. And slowly, a new kind of church began to form. No offering plate, no bulletin, no dress code, only this: come as you are, come without answers, come carrying the weight no one else let you name. And they came. Each week, a new face, each story different, but painfully familiar. I was told to sacrifice my son's mental health for the appearance of a spiritual household. I haven't touched my Bible in 5 years. Every time I open it, I hear their voices instead of God's. I thought God hated me because I couldn't obey without resenting it. And each time I'd sit there, no longer the woman terrified of apostasy, but the woman learning to believe that truth without love isn't truth at all. Lily would sometimes sit at the edge of our meetings, drawing quietly with her crayons. One evening, as the group slowly disbanded, she came over and handed me another drawing. It was the living room, cluttered and warm, with the women all sitting in their chairs, and in the corner there was a small glowing light. "What's this?" I asked, pointing to the light. She looked up and said, "That's Jesus. He comes when everyone's crying." I didn't speak. I couldn't. Because in that moment I realized she wasn't just surviving, she was seeing. And that little glowing light, it was real. It had been there the whole time, not in doctrine, not in punishment, but in presence, in mercy, in unfiltered, unscripted, unashamed love. One Monday morning, I found a letter slipped under my door. No envelope, just a folded page, handwritten in shaky lines. It read, "Grace, I haven't set foot in a kingdom hall in over a year, but I still wake up in the middle of the night afraid someone will knock on my door and ask why. I listened to your story. It didn't make me angry. It made me brave. Thank you. M." I stood in the doorway holding that letter like it was holy, because in a way, it was. It wasn't just ink on paper. It was a confession, a quiet rebellion, a whisper from the dark that finally dared to come into the light. That same week, 3 more women sent emails, one from Oregon, one from Ohio, one just a few towns over. All of them used the same word, alone. That's what we were taught to believe, that outside the truth, there was only isolation, only darkness, only Satan's voice waiting to devour us. But that was a lie, and the women who gathered in my living room were the proof. There was warmth in their eyes, laughter that started to return after years of silence, questions they were finally allowed to ask without fear of losing their worth. One night, Rachel, a nurse who'd once spent her weekends going door to door with her husband, looked up from the edge of the couch and asked, "Do you think God hears us even now?" I looked around the room, at the soft lamplight, at the open Bibles on our laps, at the Kleenex crumpled in palms and the hands resting on knees, too tired to pretend anymore. And I said, "I don't think he ever stopped." There were no gasps, no dramatic music, just stillness. Then Rachel nodded, and she smiled. Not the performative kind we'd perfected for years in church clothes and meeting halls, but a real one. The kind you smile when something fragile inside you finally rests. That night, I stayed up after everyone left. The house smelled like cinnamon and lavender. Lily was asleep, curled into her blanket like a cat. The world outside was dark, but I didn't feel afraid. I opened my notebook again, the same one I had used to pour out every raw memory, and started writing something different. Not my story this time, but names, women I had met, stories I'd been entrusted with, not to expose, but to carry, because I had learned something sacred in those gatherings, that a story told in truth becomes a lantern, and lanterns don't hide in closets. They lead others home. It didn't happen overnight. There was no viral moment, no sudden fame. Just one story passed to another, like water in cupped hands. A daughter telling her mother, a nurse sharing it with a friend in the break room, a woman playing the recording while driving alone through back roads, tears streaming down her cheeks. Each person who heard it didn't just listen, they felt it. And one by one they reached out, sometimes just a single line. I thought it was only me. Other times, paragraphs, full testimonies, buried secrets clawing their way into light. A woman from Nevada wrote, "I watched my mother die refusing treatment. She said Jehovah would resurrect her. I believed her. Now I'm 43, and I don't know what to do with this rage I carry. Your story didn't fix it, but it helped me breathe." I read that message 10 times because I understood it. The rage, the shame for feeling rage, the fear of naming what we were taught never to touch. There were more. A grandmother from Georgia who lost her grandchildren after being disfellowshipped. A young woman from Chicago who whispered her questions into a burner phone while locked in the bathroom. A wife in Oklahoma who said she hadn't heard her own thoughts in years without picturing a man at a podium correcting her. And suddenly, my kitchen wasn't just a place where women cried over coffee. It became a sanctuary. There was no plan. I wasn't a counselor. I wasn't ordained. But somehow, I became the voice people whispered toward when no one else would listen. A soft landing place, a mirror. A reminder that leaving the structure didn't mean leaving God. That choosing your child's life didn't mean forfeiting heaven. That maybe, just maybe, we were never meant to follow men who confuse control with faith. One evening, after the group had gone home and the dishes were drying on the rack, I sat in the quiet and whispered, "Lord, I didn't ask for this, but I won't run from it either. Use it. Even if all I have to offer is my broken story, use it." That prayer didn't echo. It didn't soar. It settled right into my chest like a warm stone, heavy but grounding. Because now I knew. This wasn't just my story anymore. It was a door, and I would keep it open, as long as someone out there still needed the courage to walk through. A few months after the first recording, I received an email from a woman named Teresa. It was simple, almost too quiet in its wording. She wrote, "Grace, my daughter needs a transfusion. I haven't signed the form yet, I'm scared. I heard your story 3 times in one night. Can we talk?" I stared at the message for almost an hour. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I remembered that moment. The breathless fear, the white hospital lights, the weight of a pen over a line that felt like eternity. We scheduled a call. I spoke to her from the porch, with my phone pressed tight to my ear, the wind cold and clean on my face. She was in Kansas. She cried almost the entire call. And when she finally said it, "I don't want to lose my daughter, but I don't want to lose God either." My chest tightened like I was right back in that waiting room, knees trembling, heart cracking. I told her the truth, that I couldn't make the decision for her, that I wasn't her leader, that I didn't have a theology degree or a perfect doctrine. I was just a mother, one who chose to love louder than fear. She didn't answer right away, just breathed, then whispered, "I think God led me to your voice." 3 days later, she sent me a photo. Her daughter in a hospital bed, IV in her arm, tiny fingers gripping a stuffed bear. The caption read, "Alive, thank you, thank God." I cried, not the trembling cry of guilt and hiding, but the full-bodied cry of gratitude, of weight lifted, of knowing this pain had become purpose. That same week, a woman from Virginia sent me a message. "I play your testimony in my living room while I do the dishes. It's like having someone sit beside me who understands without demanding an explanation." Another from New Mexico. "My own mother sent me your recording. She said, 'Listen to this before you give up.' I did. And now I'm still here. Still here. 2 words that echo louder than any sermon. Because survival isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's one breath at a time. Sometimes it's a whisper. Don't go." I started writing those names down in my second notebook. Not their full stories, just initials, dates, fragments. Little reminders that the fire spreading through the silence wasn't just mine anymore. It was ours, and I wasn't the only one fanning it now. In our weekly gatherings, the women began bringing their own voices, not just to cry, but to testify. Carla, who hadn't spoken above a whisper in weeks, read a verse from Isaiah and said, "I don't think we're exiles. I think we're pioneers." Rachel, who once flinched at the word worship, sang the doxology under her breath while folding napkins. I caught her smile and didn't interrupt. I just let her worship. Free. Even Lily started asking questions that made the room go still. Why would God be mad at us for helping people? There was no answer simple enough, but no one silenced her, because we all knew. Children feel what doctrine forgets. And my child was finally safe, not just in her body, but in her soul. It was a Tuesday when the letter came. Official envelope, logo in the corner. No return name. Just the words, "Congregational Notice of Disassociation, Grace Holloway." I didn't feel shocked. I didn't even feel sad. I felt clean, because for the first time they weren't pushing me away. I was already gone. They were just finally catching up to the truth I had already accepted. Still, I sat there in silence, holding that letter in my lap. Lily was in the other room drawing. The soft sound of her crayon scratching paper was the only thing grounding me. I remembered how I used to fear this moment, how they warned us, "If you leave Jehovah's organization, you leave Jehovah." But now, I knew better. I hadn't left him. I had finally found him, outside the walls. I placed the letter on the table and lit a candle beside it, not as a ritual, as a reminder that some fires don't destroy, some burn to purify. That week, Sister Evelyn came to my door. She had once sat beside me during Thursday studies, nodding gently during each verse. She was the one who had braided Lily's hair before her first memorial. Now she stood on my porch like a stranger. She held a watchtower in one hand and a pamphlet titled "Return to the Fold" in the other. I didn't ask her in, but I didn't slam the door either. She looked at me with that hesitant kindness, the kind that comes from someone who's already decided you're wrong, but still wants to appear loving. "Grace," she said quietly, "we're still praying for you. There's still time to come back before it's too late." I smiled, not out of sarcasm, but out of sadness. "Evelyn, I never left God. I left fear." She blinked, hesitated. "Don't you miss the community?" I paused, looked past her at the street, at the little chalk drawings on the driveway Lily had made that morning, at the empty chair in the corner of the porch where women now came to rest and be heard. "No," I said, "because I found a new one, and in this one, we don't measure faith by silence." She didn't respond, just placed the pamphlet on the railing and walked away. I watched her go, and I didn't cry, because I no longer needed the approval of those who only knew how to love me if I obeyed them. Later that night, Lily brought me a cup of tea and sat in my lap. She looked up at me and asked, "Mom, are you okay being the only one?" I kissed her forehead and whispered, "I'm not the only one, sweetheart. There are many of us. We've just been quiet for too long." The next morning, I opened the window before sunrise. The sky was still bruised with night. The birds had not yet begun to sing. And yet, I felt music, not the kind that needs instruments, but the kind that rises from a soul no longer suffocating under someone else's idea of God. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders, poured a cup of coffee, and sat in that silence. It didn't feel empty. It felt holy. Because what they had called rebellion, I now understood as reverence. Reverence for the God who met me outside the gate, for the Christ who walked the dirt roads, not the marble halls, for the Spirit that whispered not through doctrines, but through fireflies, drawings, and voices that once trembled, but now testify. In the months that followed, I began to see it everywhere, not in headlines, not in protests, but in the subtle shifts of women learning how to speak again, out loud, without asking permission. We didn't call it ministry, we didn't call it church. But somehow, what was growing among us had more holiness than any sanctuary I'd ever been forced to sit still inside. Every Sunday we still gathered, some weeks, 5 of us, other weeks, 15. There were no rules, only space, only safety, only truth. And from that space, something began to rise. Teresa, who once wouldn't speak a word unless she had scripture to back it up, now brought poems she wrote during the week. They were messy, raw, beautiful. One read, "I used to think obedience was love. Now I know love doesn't require silence. It listens, even when I shake." That day we all cried, and not one of us apologized for the tears. Gabrielle, who'd once led children's classes in the congregation, started mentoring other women, not as a teacher, but as a companion. She said, "I thought I was disqualified from being useful once I left. Now I think maybe I was never really allowed to be useful until I did." These were not small shifts. They were seismic, but gentle. Like the way earth moves under your feet when a tree's roots quietly split the pavement. We didn't advertise what we were doing. There were no flyers, no Instagram pages, no branded hashtags, just voices, finding each other in the dark. And maybe that's all revival ever was. Not noise, not crowds, but women gathering around battered tables saying, "I thought I was the only one, until I heard you." The letters continued. Sometimes I'd find them in my mailbox. Other times folded and slid through the crack of my door. One read, "Grace, I haven't told anyone what happened to me in the back room after I questioned a teaching. But I heard your voice and something in me woke up. I'm not ready to speak yet, but I'm finally breathing." That one. I folded carefully and tucked inside my Bible. Not as a keepsake, as a covenant that I would keep telling the truth, even if my voice trembled, even if the letters stopped, even if I never stood on a stage or wore a title again. Because this quiet revolution was not about noise. It was about light, the kind that doesn't blind, but reveals, the kind that cracks through walls once sealed with fear and finds the girl hiding underneath, waiting to be seen. And one by one, we were seeing her, in each other, and most importantly, in ourselves. One night, long after Lily had gone to sleep, I sat by the window with a blanket around my shoulders and a notebook in my lap. It had been a quiet day, No visits, no new messages. Just stillness. But the kind that feels full, not empty. The kind of quiet that listens. I opened the notebook and wrote a single sentence. I no longer believe in the God who watched me drown to test my faith. I stared at it, let the ink dry. Felt the truth of it settle into my chest like a stone that finally found its place. Because for years I'd been taught about a God who stood on the shore while we sank, only stepping in when we passed the test, when we obeyed without doubt, when we proved ourselves worthy. But that night, as the wind brushed against the window glass and the trees outside danced like old hymns without words, I knew that wasn't him. The real God, the one I was learning to trust again, was the one who stepped into the flood, not to rescue from afar, but to carry. He didn't require my perfection. He never asked me to abandon my daughter in his name. He didn't hand me guilt like a gift and call it holiness. Number. He sat beside me in hospital corridors. He wept with me in the kitchen floor at 3 a.m. He spoke through Lily's drawings, and Teresa's trembling prayers, and Gabrielle's whispered poems. He wasn't absent. He was hidden in the places religion told me not to look. And now, every time I opened my Bible, it didn't read like a manual. It read like a mirror. I saw myself in the bleeding woman who reached out for the hem of his robe, in the widow who gave all she had, not for show, but from hunger, in Mary weeping at the tomb, until a familiar voice said her name. And maybe that's all I ever needed. Not to be right, not to be clean, but to be called, by name, by love, by the sound of someone who knew my heart wasn't broken because I disobeyed, but because I had obeyed for so long in the name of a lie. I turned the page and wrote again. I thought I needed saving from the world, but it was the walls of the temple that almost killed me. Then I closed the notebook, stood by Lily's bedroom door, and listened to her breathing, even, steady, whole. She was safe, not because I obeyed, but because I loved. And as I returned to bed that night, I prayed. Not with eloquence, not with confidence, just with truth. God, thank you for finding me where they said you wouldn't be, for staying when they said you'd leave, for loving me through the silence and into the sound. I fell asleep with peace draped over me like a second blanket. Not the peace of arrival, but the peace of beginning again. It had been almost a year since I signed that paper in the hospital. A year since I lost my place in the congregation. Since the silence fell like a curtain between me and the life I used to live. I had stopped counting the days. I no longer marked the calendar with anniversaries of loss. Instead, I marked them with light, the first night Lily slept without nightmares. The Sunday we sang our first song as a group. The moment Gabrielle prayed out loud without apologizing after. But the past has a way of circling back, just to see if you're still afraid. One evening, while preparing tea for the women before our gathering, I heard a knock. It was firm, familiar. I opened the door and there stood Brother Raymond. His suit was pressed, his expression unreadable. Behind him stood another elder, younger, quieter. They had driven 3 towns over to check on my spiritual condition. I felt my spine stiffen, but not from fear, from memory, because for years I had looked to those men for approval, for direction, for identity, and now they were just men. I didn't invite them in, but I didn't close the door either. I stood in the frame, steady. Grace, Brother Raymond began. We've received word that you've been meeting with other former members, that you've been spreading doubt, leading people astray. I almost laughed, But instead I looked him in the eyes and said quietly, "I've been listening to women who were never allowed to speak. I've been reminding mothers that saving their child's life doesn't damn them to hell. If that's astray, then I thank God I left your road." He blinked, shifted his weight. The younger man looked down. "We're here out of love," he said, almost rehearsed. "No," I replied calmly. "You're here out of fear. Because when women start telling the truth, your foundation trembles." He stepped back like my words had more weight than he was prepared to carry. I wasn't angry. Not really. Because I had once been just like them, defending a doctrine louder than I listened to a heartbeat. Before he left, Brother Raymond said, "Jehovah sees all, Grace." I nodded. "Yes. And he's been watching this whole time. He saw me crying on the floor while you wrote policies. He saw me when no one visited after the transfusion. And he sees me now. Still faithful, still mother, still daughter, still his." I closed the door gently, not as an act of defiance, but as an act of closure. The kind that doesn't slam, it seals. When I turned back, the women were arriving. They didn't ask what happened. They just placed their coats on the chair backs, hugged one another, and sat in the circle we'd created together. That night, we read from the Gospel of John, and when I heard Rachel read aloud, "Perfect love casts out fear," I closed my eyes and whispered, "Amen." Because the past had knocked, but it no longer had the key. It wasn't long before they started calling it a group. At first, I resisted that word. It sounded too official, too structured, like something that needed bylaws, agendas, and sign-in sheets. But I couldn't deny what was happening. Every Thursday night, women arrived, some timidly, some desperately, carrying stories like hidden wounds under their sweaters and coats. Not all of them had left the religion. Some still sat in meetings every week, quietly bleeding behind polite smiles. Some still wore the language like a second skin. The truth, the brothers, Jehovah's arrangement. But their eyes betrayed them. They were questioning, not God, not love, not Jesus. They were questioning why those things had to come wrapped in fear. They came to my living room, not for answers, but for air. And I gave them what I could: a couch, tea, tissues, and most of all, space to tell the truth out loud. Because for most of us, that was the deepest ache. We had never been allowed to tell the truth, unless it matched the script. But now, the script had burned, and from its ashes, something real was growing. It wasn't perfect. Sometimes women argued. Sometimes one of them would leave and not return. But those who stayed changed. They began to sit taller, to speak slower, not because they were afraid, but because they were thinking. Some of them started to write again. Others began to pray. Not the rehearsed kind, but the kind with trembling breath and eyes open, as if expecting a God who wasn't afraid of their humanity. One woman, Maria, had never missed a meeting at the Kingdom Hall in 25 years. Now she sat on my porch every Thursday afternoon, watching the sky change colors, sipping coffee from a chipped mug, and whispering, maybe God was never inside those walls to begin with. And I didn't correct her, because maybe she was right. One evening, after most had gone, I stood in the kitchen washing cups when Gabrielle approached me. She held her hands together tightly, as if holding something sacred. "I want to ask something," she said. I nodded. "Would you ever teach us? Not preach. Just help us understand the Bible, the way you do." I froze for a moment, not because I didn't want to, but because for so long I was told my voice was only valid if a man approved it. I thought of all the times I sat silent while elders interpreted verses through the lens of control. All the times I swallowed questions because curiosity sounded too much like rebellion. All the times I nodded in agreement to stay safe. Now, a woman was asking me to teach. Not because I had a title, but because I had scars. I looked at Gabrielle and said softly, "I don't have all the answers, but I'll open the Word with you, and we'll listen together." Her eyes filled with tears. That night, I wrote something in my journal I never imagined writing. Maybe this was always the ministry I was meant for, not behind a podium, but on a porch, with women who were told to sit down, finally standing. And I knew I would never go back, not because I hated the place I left, but because I had finally found the God they forgot to introduce me to. It's been almost 2 years since that night in the hospital. 2 years since I chose my daughter over their doctrine. 2 years since I stopped asking men what God thought of me. 2 years since I lost everything and found what I never knew I needed. I don't know when exactly my living room became a sanctuary. There were no stained glass windows, no pulpit, no tithing envelopes. But there was presence, there was grace, there was God. I started calling it our little altar, not because we sacrificed anything there, but because it's where we stopped sacrificing ourselves. Women come and go. Some stay, some move on. But all of them leave lighter than they came. And not because I healed them, because they were finally allowed to tell the truth without being punished for it. Some nights we don't even open the Bible. We just talk. We cry. We light candles. We hold each other's hands like lifelines. We say things that once would have branded us as lost. I don't think God requires suffering to prove love. I stopped believing the day they told me my worth was in my obedience. Sometimes I just sit in silence and hope He still hears me, even if I don't know what to say. And when we do read Scripture, we don't read it to win an argument. We read it like bread, slowly, hungrily, breaking it apart with our hands and feeding our souls. We laugh now, too. We laugh at the things we used to fear, at the lies we once repeated like prayers, at the way we measured our holiness by how invisible we could become. And in that laughter, there is healing. Last week, Lily joined us. She sat quietly at first, coloring. Then, during a pause, she looked up and asked, "Can I say something?" We all turned to her, gently, expectantly. She said, "I think God likes when we talk to each other like this, because it sounds like love." And none of us spoke. We just let the tears fall, because she was right. It did sound like love. Not the love that demands, not the love that measures, not the love that shames, but the love that stays, that listens, that looks you in the eyes and says, "You're still worthy." That night, after everyone had left, I walked through the house in silence. I stopped at the mirror in the hallway. I looked at my reflection for a long time. The woman staring back was older, more tired maybe, but alive, fully, finally, alive. I placed my hand over my chest, closed my eyes and whispered, "I'm not going back." Not to fear, not to silence, not to a God I had to earn. Then I walked into Lily's room, kissed her forehead and turned off the light. The darkness didn't scare me anymore, because this time, I knew where the light was, and it wasn't behind a door I had to prove myself worthy to enter. It was already here, in me. If you've made it this far, thank you. Not for listening to me, but for letting something in these words reach you. Maybe you've never been part of a congregation like mine. Maybe you've never been disfellowshipped, disowned, or told that God abandoned you. But maybe you felt it, that quiet fear that says, if they knew who I really was, they wouldn't love me. That ache of performing holiness while your soul crumbles beneath the weight of silence. That prayer whispered into a pillow. Not for healing, not even for answers, but just so someone, anyone, would hear you. I want you to know, you're not alone. You never were. And if you've been told that questioning makes you weak, let me tell you what I've learned. It's the ones who question that finally find the real God. Not the one locked behind a podium, not the one who needs defending through punishment, but the one who walks with you in the dark, quiet, patient, kind. The one who doesn't demand silence, but invites you to speak. And if you're still inside, still afraid, still trying to be enough for a system that only loves you when you obey, I see you. I've been you, and I promise you, there is life on the other side. Not perfect, not easy, but free. There is a kind of worship that happens when you stop pretending, a kind of faith that grows in the ashes, a kind of love that finds you after the doors have closed and the titles have vanished. If I could sit with you now, across from your pain, I wouldn't offer you doctrine. I wouldn't give you rules. I'd just hold your hand and tell you what someone once told me. You are still loved, you are still seen, and you are not too far gone. Because if my story means anything, it's this, that God never needed my perfection. He never asked me to sacrifice my daughter to prove devotion. He never gave his love with conditions. People did that. But Jesus met me in a hospital hallway, in a child's drawing, in a quiet room full of women who'd been told to stay small. And he stayed. Not because I followed the rules, but because I was finally ready to stop hiding. So here I am, not righteous, not brave, not qualified, just Grace, a mother, a woman, a daughter of a God who never left. And if you needed a sign to keep going, to breathe again, to speak again, this is it. You're not crazy. You're not a failure. You're not beyond forgiveness. You are healing. And I'll be right here, voice steady, arms open, porch light on, in case you ever need to be reminded. You're not alone. You never were. And it's not too late to come home. Grace Holloway.